Once upon a time, in a small village isolated by mountains, there was a priest known to everyone as Father Lucas, a man with a stern face and deep gaze, but above all, a man who had dedicated his entire life to the service of the church. He lived in an old parish that, truth be told, was somewhat deteriorated. Over the years, the village had lost its inhabitants, and the church was left alone, almost like a forgotten relic. But Father Lucas was always there, not caring about the passage of time or the dark stories that haunted the place. It is said that on the main altar of the church, there was a very peculiar crucifix. It wasn't the typical wooden crucifix. This one had something different. The first thing that caught attention was its size. It was much larger than usual, making it imposing and strange. But what really caused unease was its appearance. Christ's face on this crucifix had an indescribable expression, neither pain, nor sadness, nor anguish. It was as if something much deeper and older was present in that image, something that couldn't be easily understood. The legend of the crucifix began to gain strength years ago. Some said Father Lucas had found the object in an old crypt on the outskirts of the village, where the elders had warned him not to enter. However, Lucas, driven by his faith and curiosity, ignored the warnings. When he returned with the crucifix in his hands, people began to notice strange changes in him. He became even more withdrawn, starting to perform unusual rituals and speaking of things no one understood. He claimed the crucifix not only represented Christ's sacrifice, but contained an ancient power, a dark force that had been dormant for centuries. From that moment on, the church began to be filled with strange presences. Some parishioners said they had seen shadows moving between the columns, and others claimed to have heard murmurs coming from the sacristy. That church, which had once been a place of peace and prayer, transformed into a site where fear grew like an invisible shadow. One stormy night, after an especially long Mass, Father Lucas disappeared. No one saw him leave the church, nor did they hear the sound of his footsteps as he walked. The next morning, when the sacristan arrived to open the doors, he found the church empty, but the crucifix was still on the altar, with Christ's figure completely distorted, as if something had taken its place. The eyes of the figure glowed with an unnatural intensity, and the features of the face seemed to move as if it were alive. From that day on, no one dared to approach the church. It was said that Father Lucas had been consumed by the power of the crucifix, that he had been possessed by an ancient and malevolent entity that had been waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. Others said that Father Lucas had made a deal with that darkness, and that now, his soul was trapped in the same place, alongside the figure of Christ that no longer seemed human. Time passed, and the village continued its life, but the mystery of Father Lucas and his crucifix was not forgotten. The stories were told from generation to generation, and many claimed to have experienced strange events when passing by the church. Some saw figures in the windows, others heard footsteps in the early morning, and some swore they felt a cold, heavy presence on their backs, as if something were watching them. However, everything changed when a group of curious young people decided to investigate the church, seeking answers about what had happened. They were kids from the village who had heard the legend since they were little, but had never dared to approach the church until now. One night, armed with cameras and flashlights, they headed to the place. At first, everything seemed calm, too calm. The church was disordered, filled with dust, but there was no sense of life, nor of death. No sound, except the echo of their own footsteps. But when they arrived at the altar, they saw what no one expected. The crucifix was there, at the center of the altar, but something had changed. Christ's eyes glowed like never before, and the figure of his body was deformed, twisting as if it were struggling to free itself from its own cross. The young people, terrified, tried to record everything with their cameras, but their hands were trembling so much that they could barely focus. Suddenly, The door of the church slammed shut. The flashlights began to flicker, and a cold wind swept through the hall. A deep, guttural voice resonated in their heads. Father Lucas didn't leave. He's here, waiting. The young people tried to flee, but the church seemed to have turned into a labyrinth. The walls closed in around them, and the shadows seemed to move by themselves. Every time they thought they had found the exit, they hit an invisible wall. The presence of the crucifix grew stronger, more intense. The cameras stopped working, and their flashlights went completely out, plunging them into utter darkness. Some of them managed to escape, but when they returned to the village, they were completely changed. No one recognized them, and their eyes reflected a deep fear, something that could not be understood with words. The few who remained in the village never approached the church again, and the stories of Father Lucas and his cursed crucifix became part of the darkest legends of the region. Years later, the church was completely abandoned. No one dared to enter, and the village faded into oblivion. But if anyone approaches the old site where the church once stood, they say they hear the distant sound of footsteps, and sometimes, if they stop at the threshold, they can see the figure of Father Lucas with his penetrating gaze watching them from the shadows.